So we're starting to look at the Bondage of the Will by Martin Luther. This was written in 1525, and this isn't the place to give any biographical information for Luther. If you're Reformed, I assume already that you have an understanding of Luther and some appreciation for him. But this was widely considered, even by Luther himself, to be his most important theological work. There's others that may be more famous. I mean, obviously, you have the 95 Theses in 1517. You have the commentaries that came out of his or around his tower experience, whether they be the commentaries on Galatians or Romans. He was writing on the Psalms, lecturing on them, and Hebrews during that decade as well. And then there's those three in 1520 that got him in trouble by the time he stood before Charles V and the Roman delegates at the Diet of Worms the year later in 1521. Well, those three books were the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, the Letter to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, and the Freedom of the Christian. And those are all good books. And of course, there's more obscure books, more controversial books that Luther would write later. But it was the bondage of the will that I think a lot of Reformed people gravitate to the most, for obvious reasons. It only upholds the doctrine of predestination, but more centrally attacks the idea of free will as something which has any advantage toward regeneration or anything like that. He's not, as we're going to see, he's not denying that human beings are volitional beings. So we're going to get a chance to tackle some of those straw men that's often thrown against the Reformed. But just as a little bit of background about his antithesis, or I guess his antagonist, to make it personal, against Erasmus. And it was personal. Erasmus, he was at first sympathetic to the Reformed cause, and he made contributions, the most valuable being the 1516 Greek New Testament. That was something that the Reformers drew on. He was a humanist scholar. We would say humanism. Anybody that's ever read Francis Schaeffer's works understands the distinction that is often made between humanism, as in secular humanism, the idea of it being kind of a mini worldview or a whole worldview unto itself, where man is the measure of all things. But that's not what's being talked about here. Humanism in this sense, lowercase h, is just a love and appreciation for and a passing on, a dealing with that which makes human beings human. The humanities, you might say, the letters. But for them, it was the rallying cry was ad fontes, back to the sources. And that had a value even before the Reformation. There was all sorts of things that challenges to Roman Catholicism, late medieval Romanism, as a result of going back to those sources. Well, just to give you one example, in that Greek New Testament, for example, in Matthew 3, what was in the Latin Vulgate, do penance. Well, you read Erasmus's New Testament and you realized at that time, well, actually, what John the Baptist is saying in that text is repent, which is a very different idea altogether. Well, that was a famous example, but there were others. As I said, Erasmus was originally friendly to the cause of the Reformation, but then he started reading Luther. He's saying, I don't know if I like this guy very much, this German guy. He's not just verbose, he's very acerbic. That's one word you could use for that. And so one of the things you have to understand about Erasmus was he was a bit of a precursor to what I call the winsome Gestapo. The tone police. These people that are all over social media as much as the people they're correcting and as much as some young men oftentimes have to be corrected in this. These are these people that have nothing better to do than to jump on your post and say, well, I'm just concerned, bro. We also call them the concern bros. Just your tone or whatever. And really, they're going for the content. They're not really attacking your tone. They're using that as a cover to silence you about things that are controversial, the areas that are most under attack in the church by the devil in our day. And that was the case for Erasmus. Well, he writes this book the year before, in 1524, called The Diatribe on Free Will. And a good amount of what Luther is going to attack is the idea that, if you're going to write a book on the free will, the least you could do is not spend so much of it saying that it's not worth talking about. Because here you are, talking about it. And that's not a new idea either. You know, Augustine dealt with that at the very outset of his book on Christian doctrine. He ran into a different sort of person, but very much a parallel kind of a card trick. You know, those people that say, well, we don't need anyone to teach us because, of course, hey, look, 1 John 2, you have the teacher inside you. That's the Holy Spirit. But Augustine basically snapped back at these people and essentially said, well, then be consistent and shut up. Because here you are yapping on as if to presume to teach to me. But if you were really consistent with your principles, you really wouldn't say anything. And that's roughly what Luther is going to say back at Erasmus. Okay, that's the Diet of Worms. We don't need to talk about that. Let's talk about the bondage of the will, specifically. I put this together for the people that are in my reading group. We're doing a study on this right now at our church and our men's group. And what I did, because I realized real quick, wait a minute, there's at least these two main translations of the bondage of the will that people read. And, the language is different, but that's not the big problem. The big problem, if you're giving homework assignments, is, it's the headings are different. So you have the Packer-Johnson translation, which is much more descriptive and helpful in terms of the subject matter to be covered, versus the Cole translation, the more traditional one, which you'll have online versions of, that has this sort of thing. And just to give you an idea, I have here, I'll give you a little bit of a picture. You've got the Johnson-Packer one here, and you've got at least the Cole one that I got. This is one of the first books I ever got as a Christian. I just stumbled into this used bookstore in Meridian, Idaho, and it was, I bet it was a quarter or something like that. And I said, hey, I know that Luther guy. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I read that book. And I actually read that book before I had read any of R.C. Sproul's books, which I started to later that year. But anyway, you've got the Cole translation and you've got the Packer-Johnston translation. And there's the basic difference there. And so you'll want to, if you're ever leading a study on that, compare those. And honestly, it doesn't take long to do. It took me like 30, 40 minutes to see where the headings were different. And I divided it into 9 weeks. However you divide it up, that's essentially what you're looking at. But getting onto the subject matter, and just to cover the introduction. And this is Luther writing back, because of course so much of the beginning is Luther reviewing Erasmus's preface, the beginning of his argument, and what comes across in the introduction is that it seems like 3/4 of it is Luther is criticizing not so much the substance of Erasmus's definitions at this point, but the manner in which he goes about his argument, because really that's what Erasmus is kind of passively aggressively doing to Luther. So Luther says, what then is your intention in observing that there are some things which ought not to be spoken of openly? For you mean to enumerate the subject of free will among those things? If you do, the whole that I have just said concerning the necessity of knowing what free will is will turn round upon you. Moreover, if so, why do you not keep to your own principles and have nothing to do with your diatribe? See? And on top of that, he's really saying, well, you're really also charging Christians with a couple of things here for peering into these things. Your accusations are actually pretty slanderous, not just against me, Luther, but against all Christians. He says, you call him who should desire to know such things irreligious, curious, and vain, but him who should disregard them religious, pious, and sober. In other words, this really begs the question as to which things we ought to be talking about versus those things that we ought not to be talking about. And in the process of doing that, actually, you're not just slandering other Christians, you're slandering God. You're presuming to lift yourself above God. You're applying to be his editor, because if you admit that these things are in any sense in Scripture, then you're kind of saying, well, maybe God didn't really think this through as far as what would be the outcome. If these things are just let loose openly, it's going to lead to these divisions. It's going to lead to pride. It shouldn't, but we'll get back to that. But Luther, here's how Luther says it. How much better is it for us wretched men to ascribe glory unto God, who knoweth the hearts of all men, the glory of determining the manner in which, the persons to whom, and the times in which the truth is to be spoken. What? Shall your Creator come to learn of you, his creature, what is useful, and what not useful to be preached? What? Did he not know before you told him that which you infer would be the consequence of his paradox? If therefore God willed that such things should be spoken of and proclaimed abroad without regarding what would follow, who art thou that forbiddest it? You know, you could back this up with John 6. Jesus drove away the crowds with precisely these doctrines. And who did he drive away? The crowds. In other words, it was evangelism. He was proclaiming out to the indiscriminate audience, not just to his disciples, but to the crowds. And by the way, he then explains they're going away that way. When Peter and others said, well, this is a tough teaching, Lord. Well, what does he say in verse 44? And then he says it again in verse 66. He says, that is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. It's Jesus' explanation for why it, quote unquote, works or doesn't work. It always works. The question is, what are you trying to have work? But then Erasmus basically says, so your problem is you make assertions. Your problem is certainty. That's your problem. Well, Luther shoots back there too. He says, for not to delight in assertions is not the character of the Christian mind. Nay, he must delight in assertions, or he is not a Christian. Nothing is more known and more general among Christians than assertions. Take away assertions, and you take away Christianity. In other words, take away declarative statements about important things that we can know, that we do know. When we shrink back in false humility, what we're really saying is, maybe God didn't really say. We're taking the side of the serpent, but we're doing so with a very interrogative tone, as if that makes us humble. That's a false humility. And that's not really something that the postmodern invented. That's something that was the very first lie of the devil. Postmodernism just made it, just gave it an intellectual dress. But of course, it now has a popular garb. We saw that with the emergent church, really just 20 years ago. And so we thought, well, that's just a fad. And on an organizational level, it was a fad. But that idea is so much a part of our culture. We speak in that very interrogative tone. And that's really what Erasmus was commending, or rather accusing Luther of not doing, as if that's somehow the assumed virtue of winsomeness. But Luther also says, on this same vein, you don't think this is necessary to talk about. What shall I say here, Erasmus? To me, you breathe out nothing but Lucian and draw in the gorging surfeit of Epicurus. If you consider this subject not necessary to Christians, away, I pray, out of the field. I have nothing to do with you. I consider it necessary. He's saying the same thing Augustine did to that person that said, well, we have no need to teach each other then. He's like, well, then shut up. Then go away. Be consistent. Practice what you preach and preach nothing. And that's very much the spirit of our age. And but that's what he does for about, it seems, 3/4 of the introduction, is he talks about that very thing. But that's not all he does. He does get to the will and say, well, does Erasmus ever define what the will is? And he's going to get deeper into this. Luther will, for his own definition as well as Erasmus's. But what he says at first is important. He says will, in other words, will per se. He's not even getting to the free will yet. Will, whether divine or human, does what it does, be it good or evil, not by any compulsion, but by mere willingness or desire, as it were, totally free. In other words, and I'll come back to this, but let me just show this picture. He's going to make a distinction between the necessity of compulsion versus the necessity of immutability. Now, there's other ways that you can describe this. And so, for example, we think of Luther's work and Jonathan Edwards' work, the freedom of the will, is so different. And in many ways they are. But one of the things that bull thinkers want to do is take away this straw man that we are against willing per se. You know the most obvious objection that comes from Arminian theology on this side. Well, you just make people into puppets, into robots, into, all that those different things that we don't choose. That is not the argument. As Calvin said, it's not the freedom of the will we deny, but the soundness of the will. So we're talking about something very specific in terms of what free will is claiming to be. And so he's going to strip that down all the way back at first to the will per se. And he's going to talk about a necessity here. And see that one on the left, the necessity of compulsion? Now, if the will is not free, in other words, if my choice is not a free choice, then the force The coercion that's going to stop it from being freedom will be an alien force, an extrinsic force. In other words, I did not choose. Something else had me under duress or determined it apart from, and that's the key, apart from. But see, of course, as we go to the right, of course, there is some necessity, there is something causing it. Your willing or your choice is not an uncaused cause. If it was, it would be God. Nor is it an uncaused effect, as if it were some quantum random reality. And that's going to be one of the ironies of the idea of libertarian free will, which, of course, Luther doesn't get into that. Those are very much more modern terms that we use for these debates. But you see that thing on the right is that option A is chosen over option B, just like on the left. The difference is what we're saying here is much more realistic, that I have an inclination. In other words, I was inclined. The nature of my will was to desire that more than option B. Those desires are the result of many things, not just genetics and circumstances, but learned behavior, habituation, my taste buds being warmed up to this versus that. And in doing so, my will has a nature that is very different than it otherwise would be. And so Luther's going to make some other distinctions, and we don't think about it as this technical like Edwards' work was, but in some things it is. And so remembering that one on the right, that my inclination is inclined, it's habituated, it's moved, and so forth. Luther is going to make another distinction between the divine will and the human will. And so one of the ways he does it is this. He says, the will of God, nevertheless, which rules over our mutable will, is immutable and infallible, as Boethius, and that's the spelling of it in the Cole, at least the original, but that's Boethius that he's talking about. As Boethius sings, immovable thyself, thou movement givest to all. And our own will, especially our corrupt will, cannot of itself do good. Or in other words, the immutable will of God and the impotency of our depraved will, or as some have expressed it, the necessity of immutability. Though neither is that sufficiently grammatical or sufficiently theological. Luther's struggling for language to express what he's talking about here. But the will of God is immutable. It is always that which prefers that which is good, that which is in himself. Okay, if you want to really get deeper into it. But really at this point, all that's necessary to say that God's will is one with all that is in God. Whereas our will, and this is reflected in the Westminster Confession of Faith, by the way, our will, even in the creation, perfect as it was a perfect creature before the fall, was nevertheless mutable by virtue of the fact that it was upheld in being. Being a creature does not have the power of being within itself. Now, that's just my own margin notes there. That's not Luther saying that, but that's really what he's getting at there. And so this is the battle that begins the bondage of the will. There's those two issues sort of swimming around. There is not only the content of what is debated, but there's also the manner in which it is said. And as in the introduction, it sure seems, and just some of that maybe is Luther's own rhetorical style, it seems like that's the bulk of what he's talking about. But he will get to the will. And as I said, the Johnston Packer translation tells you up front the order in which he's going to talk about it. So as I close, I'll bring that in one more time, because that's a good guide. He, in the introduction, those second and third numbers there, he reviews Erasmus's preface and the introduction. And then he gets into, review of his arguments for free will is also still part of the introduction. That section 5, 6, and 7 on the right matches up to Cole's discussion, first, second, and third part. So the first part is the review of Erasmus's treatment of texts that deny the free will. So Erasmus has to do something with what we would call total depravity texts. And then number 6 on the right is the second part, review of Erasmus's treatment of texts that deny free will. So that's divided into 2 parts. And then it's finally the third part that Luther will get to the Bible doctrine of the bondage of the will, and then his conclusion. So that's a basic review of it, and we're going to be in it for 9 weeks. There's no right way to do it. But however you divide it up based on your own reading schedule. Of course, we do every other week, so that's part of it. There, we probably can read it a lot faster. You could probably do this book in a month if you had the time to do it. But it's well worth reading. Again, it was written in 1525. Arguably, it's Luther's most important theological work. And I hope to do other videos of this nature, dividing into different sections. This will be in the section I'll call Reformation Readings. And so I'll probably do at least two more, maybe three, maybe the three parts of, maybe I'll divide it like that. So it'll be 4 parts in all after this intro on Luther's Bondage of the Will.